Hey, welcome to this open hour. William, it's cool to see you on. Hello, and as always, you're asking really good questions. So we can jump right into your question, actually, because as I say, it's very insightful, and it's like beautiful because it's the kind of stuff that I've been writing about and working on in lesson 19. So let's jump into it. And speaking of lesson 19, just as a quick update, actually, before I jump into that. So I'm working on the illustrations for lesson 19, which is the second to last lesson in part 5. And it is, I'm almost done with the illustrations. So it's about 126 illustrations, and I'm on illustration like 97 or something. So it's coming along, and as always, this lesson is my favorite. I'm so excited to get this out, and like I say, it talks about the circle of fifths. And so to William's question, I'm going to share this question, which and William, as we're talking through this, you can elaborate on these points. So I'm going to read through this for the benefit of anyone who's on or will be watching the replay on this. So the question is regarding the circle of fifths, right? So we got the chord map here, and there are different modes. You can turn the grouping layer like a dial and go from light to dark modes. And these modes are parallel modes in that they share the same tonic. So in the key of F, for example, well, let's go to C, just because we so often use that as an example. And yeah, definitely, William. So C is the tonic in these major modes. Lydian is a major mode. It's very bright. And like I say, I talk about this in lesson 19, so I haven't really expounded on this in videos, but these are the major modes. They all have a major 1. And then as you continue to rotate, you start getting into the realm where the 1 is a minor tonic, a minor chord. And it's a weaker tonal home bass. And, for lack of a better term, the minor chords are relatively sadder sounding or more melancholy. Dorian, Aeolian, and Phrygian, the minor 1 is the tonic in all of those cases. And then once you get down here, C, diminished, a diminished 1 is the tonic, and we're into Locrian, which is the darkest of the modes. So, to the question here, William said, in a recent song analysis, you showed how the Beatles composed a song in Ionian and borrowed a chord from Aeolian. And I think the song was, well, there have been a couple of Beatles songs that have done that. Across the Universe, maybe the one that you're referring to. There's also some Aeolian borrowed chord that makes its way into In My Life. Both of them are John Lennon songs. But a lot of songwriters do that. So anyway, I think the key was D, and it was Across the Universe. So the question here is, how many shifts can you make in borrowing chords before losing harmonious relationships? Okay, so that's the main question here. So let's speak to that first. Well, let's read through the question, and then we'll address the answer in full. So, for example, if I use your colored chord map and I'm in C Ionian, and I can rotate the inner wheel, which envelops the 7 chords in a key. So let's go through this so everyone's following along. We have in the key of C, for example, C Ionian, which is a fancy name for the key of C major, and its chords major 1, minor 2, minor 3, major 4, major 5, minor 6, diminished 7, and back to 1, or the tonic, major C major here. And it's cool because it's this star pattern back to the total home bass or the tonic. Now, is that in focus? Sorry, I'm trying to get the focus there. So back to the question. So that grouping, say in the key of C, if you rotate the box to the left, to Mixolydian, 3 of the chords from Ionian are gone, but 3 are added. So let's go through this in time. So here we have these 7 chords. And when we rotate 30 degrees to the left to get to C, Mixolydian, it's a parallel mode. Parallel in the sense that they share a tonic. And if you were to depict these chords in a table format, they'd be parallel, hence the name parallel. In a circular formation, parallel isn't as intuitive a title, but that's what that's referring to. So we have these 7 chords. When we come over here, we actually lose 2 of the chords. So notice in Ionian, G and E minor are part of the group, but when we shift over here, G and to personify these, they get uninvited from that party. Now the new party is over here. Now the 4 chords of, well, you know what? You're right. We do lose this as well. So we lose those 3 chords, G, E minor, and B diminished. And when we come over here, we keep these same 4 chords and we add these 3 chords that are unique to Mixolydian. And then when we rotate further, again, these 3 chords from that Mixolydian get lost. We share those 4 chords, and then these new chords in Dorian come on, and so on. So if we were to show these in the circle of thirds, which is another depiction of the chords in a key, you would see that these chords, E minor, G, and B diminished, are on the right side of the circle of thirds. And so as we're coming into the next key over, we lose those 3, and we pick up these 3, and so on. So back to the question. I talked so long that I lost my the screen timed out. Let me pull that up. All right, so if I rotate 1 box to the left to Mixolydian, 3 of the chords from Ionian are gone, but 3 are added, as we just looked at. Move it to the left again to Dorian, and I again lose 3 chords from C Dorian, but gain 3. I can move it 1 more time to the left, so Aeolian, and still have 2 chords, specifically G minor and B diminished. Let's just, so we started Ionian, we're rotating over to Aeolian, and we have chords G minor, and I said B diminished, but I meant B flat. So those 3, or those 2 chords. I can move it 1 more time to the left to Aeolian and have those chords from the original Ionian scale. So actually in Ionian, you still do have G as a root note, but it's G minor rather than G major. And then B flat is in Mixolydian, but not in Ionian. So, and you can move to Phrygian, and none of the chords from the original C Ionian scale exist. So now if we go all the way over to Phrygian, you do have at least the root note, not the same chord. So you have C minor instead of C major, and you do have a G diminished, at least the root note of G is there. But these other ones are not in Ionian. But all of the chords have changed now. It doesn't share any of the same chords. In fact, once you move into Dorian, it doesn't. We've gone beyond the boundary of Ionian. So the furthest to the left over here is F major and D minor. Once we get to Aeolian, that is, which is a 90-degree rotation from Ionian over to Aeolian, that's where there's no overlap with actual chords. We do have some of the same root notes, but the chord qualities have changed. We have a D diminished instead of a D minor. We have a C minor instead of a C major, F minor instead of F major, and G minor instead of G major. So they've all, it's a totally different party. Like none of the same original guests at this party are part of that group. All right. So making our way to the next question. So it's really Aeolian when there's no overlap. So does that mean that I could borrow chords from the first 3 rotations to the left and no more? That's a great question. Here, let me underline that. So we've got that question. And then could all of these chords from different modes be borrowed and maintain harmony with the original chords of C Ionian? Or are there other rules that apply when borrowing chords to maintain harmonious relationships with the song's original key and mode? So let's answer the first two questions and then these questions. So how many shifts can you make in borrowing chords before losing harmonious relationships? So when it comes to parallel modes, and the parallel modes are those that are labeled by, Lydian all the way over to Locrian, because again, C, we're in the key of C, for example, C diminished, C minor, and C major show up in that range of harmonies. You can, however, I know these aren't labeled, but it's not exactly a no man's land in that you can have chords from over here from non-parallel mode territory show up in a progression. For example, you could have a major 6 chord or A major. You could that could show up in a progression as a secondary dominant to D minor, for example. Or you could have D major. This is a common one, like in jazz, is a major 2, major 5, and 1, 2, 5, 1. That rounding, the bases, to use a baseball metaphor, back to home base, this circle of fifths or circle of fourths, really going counterclockwise, that motion is very pleasing. And so let's hear it, for example. So let's say we're playing in the key of C, and then D. So even though it's outside of even the parallel, well, that is Lydian. It is in Lydian. But if we were to, say, have a major 6 to a minor 2, so we're outside of even Lydian, we have, because it's harmonically related. So you do have harmonically related, and it has to do with the geometry. So there's this underlying geometry, like all of the geometric connections that we talk about at length in part 1 of the course. Okay, this is great. So the perfect triangles of major thirds between the root notes, the squares of minor thirds or sixths, all of those relationships are still there. They informed the movement between notes in the formation of scales, but because music is fractal, you have scales that are built on these geometric patterns, and then you have chords that are derived from scales, and then you have modes that are derived from scales, and then you have chords that are built from scales, and then modes are built from scales, and then you have chord progressions that are built from modes. It's just like all of these intricate relationships. And like I say, part 5, lesson 18, I get into modes at length. And so there are all these relationships at play, and that geometric foundation informs those relationships. And so you do have these parallel modes off to the left, the counterclockwise, but you do have like secondary dominance, and you have things like tritone substitutions and other rules, or it's not really rules as it is just the underlying patterns that inform connections between notes. So I'm kind of wanting to make sure I'm answering the question. So the first question is, how many shifts can you make borrowing chords before losing harmonious relationships? So really, I would say most of the time, you do get some Lydian borrowed chords, like with the major 2, that shows up a lot, this progression of 2, 5, 1 in jazz music and various songs, using Ionian as a foundation, right? So you could start a song like Norwegian Wood, for example, is a mix of Lydian, and it goes into Dorian, the Beatles song Norwegian Wood. This Bird Has Flown is the full title. Starts in Mixolydian, goes into Dorian, and back to Mixolydian. So it doesn't have to be Ionian as the foundation, but a lot of the time Ionian is used as the foundation because it's such a pleasing mode. The major scale is very pleasing. It's foundational to music. It's got kind of an upbeat or uplifting, bright kind of sound. And so a lot of times, I mean, the 1-4-5 of the 12-bar blues is based on Ionian. And so it's so foundational to modern music that it's the foundation of a lot of songs. So using that as the baseline, you can borrow some from Lydian. You might sometimes get a minor 7, major 2 a lot of times. But going this direction, dipping into the darker part of the modal spectrum is where you hear more borrowed chords. And so you get a flat major 7, for example. Like in the song Hey Jude. So, that went straight into mixing a bit. But sometimes this might just be a borrowed chord. So maybe doesn't shift into Mixolydian. You're staying solidly within Ionian, but you sometimes just kind of dip over and bring in that flat major 7. That does show up quite a bit. Dorian, you do get some borrowed chords, but I would say much of the time you have this relationship. It's a 90-degree rotation, which is not coincidental because of that 90-degree relationship between C and E flat, because C minor is E flat major's relative minor chord, and that relationship is a strong. Sorry, I'm trying to give enough information without getting totally into the weeds, but there is a geometric relationship between those, and therefore, if you're an Ionian, you do dip into Aeolian. That's probably some of the most common borrowed chord usage going on. So let's see, you get a minor 4, for example. So how that progression goes, but there's In My Life brings in a minor 3, or Across the Universe. So it's words are flowing out so it's in the key of D. So 1, 6, 3, and then 2, and then minor 3, and then back to 1. So that minor 4. So you got a 1. Flowing out like endless rain into a paper cup. So basically what we're doing is we're in the key of D. So D is D Ionian. So it's 1, 6, 3, minor 2, and instead of just going to a major 4, it comes over to Aeolian, where D minor is the tonic, and we get that minor 4. And then it comes back to a D. So it's so 1, 6, 3, minor 2, minor 3 to that or minor 4, and then back to the 1. So Aeolian is like a great target region for pulling in borrowed chords. So, and then as you get past that, you start getting less and less usage of borrowed chords as you start getting darker, because it is starting to get further and further away from your home base. It's not unheard of to have those chords, but it is less common. And so that hopefully kind of answers your question, because even though in Aeolian, we are no longer, now we're in the key of D, even though once you hit Aeolian, you're no longer within that home grouping. These are, because of the geometric relationships and those intervals at play in those chords, it is still pleasingly close enough, but you start getting further away. You start kind of like losing the gravitational pull back to that home mode. And so you're like further out in space, as it were. All right, let's go to, that's not to say that it's unheard of. It's just not as common. Okay, so does it mean that I could borrow chords from the first 3 rotations to the left and no more? It's more common. It's not to say that thou shalt not. So you've got, again, assuming you're an Ionian, so 1 Mixolydian, 2 Dorian, and 3 Aeolian. It is more common because they're closer in harmonic relationship. There's more overlap, but you will find some chords that show up like a tritone substitution where you get this chord that is like a flat major 2, which we'll get more into that in terms of the logic behind that. But there are like the 7 chord of a flat major 2 shares a couple of notes with the 5, which is the dominant chord. And so it can serve as a substitution back to the 1. And there's interesting relationships at play that can inform harmonic movement beyond just that tighter range. And like I say, even over into the right area, which is where we have secondary dominance and substitute chords for other reasons beyond parallel modes. All right, so to the question of could all of these chords, so I'm in this part right here, could all of these chords from different modes be borrowed and maintain harmony with the original chords of C Ionian, or are there other rules to apply when borrowing chords to maintain harmonious relationships with the song's original key and mode? Phew. Those are great questions. So yeah, with so you're definitely like jumping into the chord map and like really picking it apart, which is wonderful. Like that's what it's all about. And yeah, so to summarize, these tighter, closer regions, not venturing too far from home, with the Ionian being our home in this case, sometimes a little bit to the right, often to the left, and that's where the most common, this is the most fertile ground for borrowing chords. And then sometimes a little further out, but not as often. But then there are reasons to borrow chords from over here, like I say, with secondary dominants, and based on the harmonic relationships, the geometry at play between the root notes, and it's more than just the root notes. It's like all of the chords in a harmony. There's geometry at play. The geometry that informed everything building up to this is still there. It didn't go away. It's still actively influencing those connections, and I'll definitely be talking more about this with more illustrations to show the relationships at play. But those are some excellent questions, and hopefully that helps validate, frankly, what you kind of outlined as, and I'd be interested to know, are you playing around with some of those chords and finding those relationships to be true? Like as you venture past Aeolian, are you starting to find that those chords don't sound as harmonious? Maybe hence the question, because it's a great question. So yeah, definitely more on that. So yes, that helped. Thanks. Can you, we got double the 2 fingers on the comments here. So yes, that helps. Thanks. Can you think of songwriters who often borrow chords far from the original key / mode successfully? I mean, I don't mean to just be so siloed in on the Beatles, but John Lennon was known for so the Beatles were known for their mastery of harmony. And I'm going to have an ongoing series on Beatles song insights, because I love the Beatles and because I think it's super insightful for songwriting. You know, a lot of songwriters cite the Beatles as an influence, but they just kind of leave it at that. Like, hey, yeah, the Beatles were an influence. And then they write great songs themselves. But it's like, okay, so what, is there some secret handshake, some secret code that went on? Like, why do you love them other than it sounds great? Like I can hear it, but what's the logic? But then they never get into it. Like they never actually explain. So hence that ongoing series that I'm going to be adding to and long answer to a short question. So the Beatles were masters of harmony, and John Lennon often got pretty far out. I mean, there are some songs like I Am the Walrus, which is like, whoa, there's some strange harmonic progressions going on there. And yes, and they do get further from just the close parallel modes. So we'll get into that. And I'd be interested to know if there are any artists that you listen to who you're like, yeah, these guys actually do have some interesting things. Jazz gets into jazz is based on the harmony, the geometry of music. Whether they say it explicitly or not, it actually is. So Simon and Garfunkel, Joni Mitchell, like you say, I think I've heard departures with great harmony, but never knew how to analyze them since I'm only a tiny bit into music theory. Yeah, so Paul Simon, I think, is brilliant, and he is more straightforward with his just being candid about his understanding of music theory. I've listened to some really interesting interviews with him where he said, like, yeah, it's based on patterns, like, and he kind of gets into it more. He doesn't necessarily spell it out in detail, at least from what I've heard, but he will acknowledge that music theory is a thing. Whereas the Beatles were like, hush, hush, like hold their cards close to the chest and pretend like there's nothing to see here. Which I wish they were more open than they were. But yeah, Paul Simon is an excellent, Simon and Garfunkel, Paul Simon is excellent. Some of their, certainly Paul Simon, like solo, started getting more adventurous, I think, with some of the progressions. I mean, that's not to downplay Simon and Garfunkel albums themselves, but he did start to get into some other types of progressions. Joni Mitchell, I know of. I actually don't know Joni Mitchell super well myself, but that'd be interesting to pick apart some of her songs and see what goes on there. Yeah, that's, I mean, really, William, your questions are so great because it's the stuff that I'm interested in terms of harmony and chord progressions. And like it's the getting at the truly practical application of all of this. I talk about, the 4 layers of music in a lot of videos. Certainly in the course, I think it's part 4 where we talk about, the rhythm / percussion, harmony, melody, and lyrics being like 4 main layers or ingredients of a song. And harmony is just so foundational, and it's some of the most involved. And then melody, of course. So it's like the two layers of harmony and melody are like, if you strip away lyrics and you strip away percussion, you have like classical music. If you strip away the melody and the harmony and have more lyrics and percussion, it's more like rap music. And so it's not so much based on theory. I mean, you have some basic chord progressions, but it's not as like founded on music theory. So to have all 4 in sync, it's all based, all of those layers work in tandem based on music theory. And really harmony is probably the most involved because of those relationships, because you're playing notes simultaneously and in sequence to form a chord progression. And so that was always the part of music that was the most confounding for me, because it seems so like, oh man, how could you wrap your head around all of these patterns? And then once you see the logic and that it's all based on geometry and it's all just patterns, and you slow music theory down. That's the thing that always tripped me up about music notation. Is music notation, I talk about this in the course, is music notation, because it is showing pitch and rhythm together, or space and time. You're already like, think fast, because it's like rhythm is already baked into all of the patterns. And so you're having to think in terms of time and sequence, and you're not able to slow things down and think about those relationships separated from time. Just think about the spatial relationships, which are intervals. To be able to slow things down to the point of freezing time and just taking in the picture is so important. And I couldn't put my finger on why notation was more than irksome. It was completely confounding. And that was a big part of it, is one, because it forces you to think fast, but then also it forces you to think in this warped, deformed pattern, because you're taking that space and you're basically squeezing it in an unnatural way. And so hence the pain of at least my experience, and I think a lot of people with traditional notation. I'll definitely be geeking out about all of the stuff. So much of my juices have been going into part 5 that it's been just so engrossing that I'm like, oh man, there's so much to talk about once this course is done. So William, Joni Mitchell has one album called Mingus, interesting, in which she collaborated with Charlie Mingus, but he died before they finished. Interesting. Yeah, Joni Mitchell is like prolific. I know that she's written a lot of stuff. I'll have to check that out. I am not familiar with it, which may sound blasphemous. Sometimes I'll be like, oh yeah, I should know about that. By sometimes I mean all the time. There's always all sorts of good stuff out there. Would you say Joni Mitchell is like one of your favorites? And Simon and Garfunkel, I think Bridge Over Troubled Water, that album as a whole is a masterpiece. Every time, and that's the thing I love about that era, especially, is albums as a whole, that you could listen to an entire album like it was a piece of art. It wasn't designed to be chopped up and just, on some playlist that was digitized. It was meant to be a cohesive experience. I know Lenny Kravitz talked about that in recent years, where he was bemoaning is probably not the right word, but he was just he was missing the days of the full album. And a lot of artists, are like, yeah, they grew up on albums, like the full experience of, the tracks, not necessarily a concept album, but just the whole cohesive experience. Bridge Over Troubled Waters is, I think, one of the best examples of that. Charlie Mingus. Check that out. You said, I love her work. I lean towards rock and Pink Floyd in the 70s, my favorite, or my formative years. Yes. But I think she's brilliant. Her album Blue was well worn on my record player needle. That's awesome. That's cool. And Pink Floyd is amazing as well. I've more than dipped my toe in the Pink Floyd waters, but I haven't done like a full-on swan dive. So there's a lot of music that I have, or a lot of Pink Floyd songs that I haven't totally heard, but they have such innovative, like, production is an interesting way to approach songs as well. And so that was another question that I saw recently here on Locals, is the question of the qualities of songs, and how do you paint a sonic picture using these patterns. And it's multiple things. So you've got one of the biggest, and again, I talk about this in part 5. I know I keep talking about part 5. It's because I'm fully engrossed in part 5, and it is definitely coming together. Has been coming together, and I'm on lesson 19 doing the illustrations. So modes is one of the most powerful ways that you can shape the sound of a song, is just the chord, the harmonic foundational layer of this is the emotional thrust of the song. This is how the patterns are coming together. But then production on top of that, you could have two totally different sounding songs, or have the same song produced in two different ways that sound totally different, even though it's the same chord progression, because of the way that it's produced. And all that to say, Pink Floyd was like, whoa, masterful. I actually don't know who produced their songs, but whoever it was amazing. William, so in terms of harmony, David Gilmour leaned heavily on chord tones in his solos and outlined chords for great harmonious sound. Yeah, he is so great. And whenever I think of David Gilmour, it makes me think of course, now I'm going to blank because you know how it is, like when you're trying to remember a name, and then you could think of it any other time, and then the moment you need to think of it, Douglas Adams. So he was friends with Douglas Adams, who did Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and they were friends, of course, because they were both like far out and super interesting. And Douglas Adams, played guitar, just liked to dabble with guitar, played guitar. And so I think he like even performed live at least once, if not more than that, with David Gilmour. And how crazy would that be to play with David Gilmour? You're just like, hey, we're playing. Hey, I wrote this great book, and that's kind of how he got, I think, on stage. Other than they were friends, but yeah, that would be super cool. Hey, Peter, it's cool to see you on. So the 15 major keys / scales in the circle of fifths all have 7 parallel modes. So is there a Roman numeral system of identifying the borrowed chords? Okay, let me read that again to make sure that I'm soaking it in. So, and we'll look at the what you mean by the 50, just for everyone's benefit of what we mean by 15 keys and scales in the circle of fifths. They all have parallel modes, yes. Music is cyclical and symmetrical, so all keys have the same parallel relationships. So is there a Roman numeral system of identifying the borrowed chords? Yeah, so that's a good question. So here we have in the key of D, for example, we've got Ionian. So just to clarify, so I mean in terms of identifying the progressions of chords used in the song with borrowed chords. Yeah, so here in the chord map, we have, let's say we have like the 2 chord or the 6 chord, okay? So the 6 is the, sometimes this would be like a secondary dominant. So we're playing a D, and then let's play a progression of like 1, 6, 3, 5, 1, major 6, 2. Let's play around with that, okay? So we've got D, 6, 3, 5, 1. Sorry, let me do D, B, so we're borrowing this B from over here. So this major 6 to a 2, you could call it a major 6, but you could also call it the 5 of 2. It's the secondary dominant, because going in a clockwise direction from the minor 2 to B minor, this major chord is the secondary dominant. It's a major 7, or it's a major 5, I mean, to this chord, which is in the key. So secondary dominant is basically a dominant chord of a non-tonic chord in the key. So all of these other chords in the key, other than D, because D is already the tonic, they all have secondary dominants, and secondary dominants are major chords. So they're going to show up over here. And so this 6, it's Roman numeral 6 because it's not the minor 6, it's the major 6, hence the uppercase Roman numeral. But another way of referring to that is the 5 of 2 or 5/2. So major 5 of 2. And so that's another way of does that kind of answer your question? So yeah, these other chords that are not in the key are secondary dominants, and a lot of times secondary dominants are called 5 of whatever it's a secondary dominant of. So this is a 5 of 2. This is a 5 of 6. This is a 5 of 5. 1 is already the 5 of 4, so you wouldn't really call it the 5 of 4. It's just 1 already. But these 5 ofs, so 5 slash one of those other chords in the key is a way to refer to those. Okay. So on your other question, Peter, so the 15 keys. So hopefully that kind of answers the question as far as Roman numerals for those. But just to your point about the parallel keys. So let's talk about the parallel keys or parallel modes for all keys, and then about the 15 keys. Because someone watching this who doesn't know about the 15 might be like, what are you talking about? There's 12, not 15. So the just in terms of the different keys, so parallel modes. So we're saying D is the 1, major 1. It's a minor 1, and it's a diminished 1 over here. So if we just rotate through, we've got, Lydian, lightest mode, down to Locrian, the darkest mode. Okay, so that you have parallel modes to D as the tonic. But if we shift it over, let's shift this over to the right now. So now we're looking at A is the tonic. And because music is cyclical and symmetrical, A also has Lydian, going down to like Aeolian, A minor is the 1, and then down to A Locrian. Or let's just switch it up completely. Let's come way over here, just randomly picking, let's say F sharp / G flat, and that's the 1. So we have Lydian, and then Aeolian. I'm just doing some of the main stops along the way, but you can go through the whole modal spectrum. And so all around the circle, all keys have the same parallel modes. It's the same structure. Okay, so now that we're over here, though, you can see that we're starting to get slash names. And there was a live stream that I did somewhat recently about these different names, because like from C, as you go clockwise, you start accumulating more and more sharps. There's more and more sharps. The sharp is that hashtag symbol. And then if you were to go to C, and then let's go back to C. C in traditional music notation has no sharps or flats in its key signature. And so as we go to the right, we get more and more sharps. As we go to the left or counterclockwise, we get more and more flat names. But you do start getting some sharps over here because as you wind and you make your way past that tritone all the way into this region, going clockwise, you do start to accumulate more and more sharps, and vice versa. You still have some flats over here. So to your point, Peter, I meant that technically there are 15 keys with no sharps, with no double sharps or double flats. Yeah. So as we come down here, so I'm going to go to the tritone of C. So this is where we have lots of sharps and flats because we've made our way. This is like the South Pole to the North Pole, to use a geography metaphor. Is over here we have more and more sharps, more and more flats. And so F sharp, the key of F sharp going clockwise, is synonymous or enharmonic. It's another name for the key of G flat going counterclockwise from C. Likewise, D flat is another name for C sharp. B is another name for C flat. And so you have over here on the South Pole, to continue using our geography metaphor, is you have like every single chord has double names, because it could go by its sharp names or it could go by its flat names. And so in traditional notation, there are keys where you have like, yes, C sharp and C flat. Yes. So you have C sharp and C flat, and the key of C flat is another name for B, or the key of C sharp is another name for D flat. I'm not changing the Roman numerals to show that, but I will so you can see. So you could say this is C sharp, D sharp, E sharp, F sharp, G sharp, A sharp, B sharp, and then C, or you could call it D flat, E flat, F, G flat, A flat, B flat, C, and D flat. And I lean towards flats more because for a couple of reasons, actually. So there are you can start to trim away. even just minute savings of having to articulate certain sharps and flats. A lot of times it's easier to use flats because you have fewer symbols. Even if it's just one less sharp or one less or one more natural note. Also because modes are, let's go back to C, because mode patterns, because they're to the left, we talked about, you know, if this was a traditional circle of fifths shown as key signatures, you do accumulate more sharps. You've got an F sharp, and then you have a C sharp, right? And then you've got a G sharp and a D sharp. Like, you're getting those more and more sharps like you do in key signatures in traditional notation. But notice with parallel modes, we're going counterclockwise into the flat zone. We're going into more of the flat keys, as it were, when we get into parallel modes. And since songwriting, borrowed chords, modal mixture, a lot of these harmonic progressions are pulling from the flat region. And if you look at, and again, in lesson 18, I do spell this out. You'll see it once I publish it, is that modes are lean towards the flats for that reason. And so it's helpful to think of, so yes, there are 15 keys, but it is helpful to think of, it's a related point, it's a little bit different, but of keys in their flat terms, if that makes sense. And so some of those extra 3 beyond 12, those overlapping lots of sharps and lots of flats, that those extra 3 of the 15 is where we start to get that overlap of extra sharps and flats. Anyway, so William, so to find secondary dominants, it seems that the easiest way with the color wheel is to move one space to the right of the chord in which you want the dominant and make sure it's major. Okay. Yeah, that's a good synopsis. So if I want the secondary dominant of D minor, go to the right, which is going to be its 5th, and then I go to its major. And the cool thing is that it's this spiral formation between the root notes of A major, A minor, and A diminished. And because music is cyclical and symmetrical, it's the same for G, G major, G minor, G diminished, C major, C minor, C diminished. So once you understand this like structure that's consistent, and it's based on these geometries, and it gets so much more wild, like we're just barely like scratching the surface, but these geometric relationships and these spirals and other relationships inform where you can go. And the cool thing is where you can go for borrowed chords is what I mean. And so the cool thing is that once you learn these for one key, these relationships, then you learn them for all 12 or all 15 because they follow the same patterns. And so, yeah, that's basically the rule of thumb, is that for a secondary dominant, you go to the right and then find the major chord. And the major chord, the actual secondary dominant, is going to be in this inner ring because they're all major chords. So it's not going to be like, hey, it's going to be over here somewhere. It's going to be, because of that spiral arm, it's going to be this way and in the center. It's like, once you kind of know like where your eyes, like you can anticipate, it's like, you know, throwing a baseball. Like once you get a feel for that's the motion and you know, your eyes follow where you're going to throw. It's the same with navigating, you know, dancing on this beautiful dance floor of the ChordMap. Those are such great questions. And secondary dominants show up a lot. There's actually also relationships between secondary dominants and the diminished chords. I kind of touched on this in some of the picking apart some songs during the holidays, where there's diminished chords that actually were in essence the same as the secondary dominant because they shared some notes. Awesome. Yes, I'm glad that helps. Secondary dominants show up so much. It's funny, like when I first was getting into modes, for the longest time, and by that I mean years, I just poo-pooed modes, I thought, who really cares about modes? Because so much was, based on Ionian mode. I even call Ionian mode a mode now because modes are so important. But the major key, just thinking about major key, but really modes are super important. But just like with traditional notation, you can sometimes leap into the deep end and not get your footing. With, for example, starting with rhythm or time and pitch or space. Like if you start with rhythm too quickly, it can kind of like, you don't have your bearings, or the universal you don't have your bearings or a feeling for, okay, what are these pitch relationships, which is really what matters in music. And then you can apply time onto that. But it's like, if you don't know the motions, then it's like, I talk about this in the course, like it's like Tai Chi. It's like practicing. When I realized I actually had a class in university where it was like an elective, but it was like a Tai Chi class, and it was like, slow motion movements. And I never knew this because it always seemed like it was just such this, peaceful motion. I always thought of hippies doing Tai Chi. And then, the instructor was like, okay, so this is a, slow motion, hit to the jugular. Then the knee comes down, cracks the ribs. And I was like, what? Tai Chi is like this. It's a fighting. It's like slow motion fighting. And so that's why I talk about it in the course of lesson 9, where it's like, once you like get these motions down, or the relationships of notes and chords within space, then when you speed it up, you're like a kung fu fighter. Like, but it's having practice it in a slow motion form that you can then speed it up and do great things. So it's the same with traditional notation. Start slow, meaning start with like no time, as racing your mind. It's like, start with just space and then apply that. And then my point that I'm kind of meandering towards is that with modes, it is helpful to start with just the major key, get a feel for those relationships between chords, and then throw on you have permutations of these patterns, which are modes. And then it like, it all comes together. Like if you start with modes and have all these permutations on top of just the core patterns, it could be overwhelming. I like the Bruce Lee time. I could just do Tai Chi motions for the last 10 minutes we have here, and it would just be so satisfying. But yeah, I remember I was in the sunshine because the course was, the class was outside, no socks, no shoes, just in the grass, being a hippie. And then it's just a slow motion cut to the jugular. Like, to the jugular? Wow. It's not what I thought Tai Chi was. It's totally what it is. And it's the same with music theory. Take it slow and then speed up. These are such great questions. Great geeking out about music theory. So these are the kinds of conversations. I don't know about the Tai Chi, but I guarantee, back to the Beatles, they talked about these relationships. They talked about these patterns, because you can hear it, you can see it in their songs. And like I say, the ongoing series about Beatles Insights is something I've wanted to do for a super long time. It's, everything in its order. Part 5 is definitely coming along, and I am excited about it. There's a question here. I always am looking to the comments here because I'll always prioritize comments live. And there is one that I wanted to speak to. That's one of them. Yeah, so this question from Azure is a really good one. So the gist of this question is, so this is in part 2 of the course, where I talk about within the circle of thirds, these chords, let me zoom in on that, are the most consonant, because it's the 1, 4, 5. And the root notes of those chords, as you can see, are very harmonically related because they are neighbors in the circle of fifths. And then within the circle of thirds, you have these more dissonant chords, the minor chords and the diminished chord, which are like in the outer ring. So you have this like this consonant orbit of gravity between the most consonant chords of 1, 4, and 5. And then you have the minor and diminished chords, which are like, like I say, they're further out in orbit. So Azure, I love this diagram, by the way, of showing to illustrate the question, which is, it seems as though these colors being the brightest or the lightest on, say, a color palette would be the most consonant. And then these ones would be, because they're not as light, they don't have yellow. There's no yellow in F, and C doesn't have any yellow. So those it seems as though those should be the ones that are on the perimeter and not on the inner core. And so it's a point that brings up a great clarification that's needed, which is that the colors, and I have an answer to this on the post, but just for conversation here, is that when we talk about consonants between chords, and this inner ring of consonants is not describing the colors per se, it's describing the harmonious relationships between those chords. And so when I say that, the major chords, so all of these chords are major and these minor chords sound relatively sad, it's not that I'm saying that the color yellow, which as a color is very bright, the sun is bright, sunflowers are bright, yellow makes me happy. I have a yellow cloth here. It's a very bright color, but we're not ascribing the visual emotional associations with colors to the harmonic sounds. Totally separate. It's the sounds that give the quality of a major, a brighter sound versus a minor. So major chord is based on C. A minor chord is a minor chord. It's still based on C. So we could have a major chord, for example, that is B flat or E flat. So E flat, G, and B flat. That sounds happy, even though the root is super dark. And we could have an E minor chord, which is based on a yellow E, but it's a minor chord, so it sounds relatively melancholy or a little more pensive. So it's not saying that this note, anything built on this note is going to sound happy and anything on that note is going to sound sad because of the colors. It has to do with the harmonious relationships between those chords, between the notes, and the colors help to show the distance and the harmonic relationship between those notes due to the geometries. So all that to say, don't let the emotional, let the visual appearance of a note fool you, as the saying goes, because it's not the color that imbues the sound, it's the underlying frequency of the note that gives it its sound, and the harmonies, whether it's major or minor. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. All right, and then another question, which Anna asked here, which is, does playing, okay, so looking at the chord map, so cool to see the chord map on your keyboard here, which is wonderful, Anna. So example, E Ionian. So we'll pull up E Ionian. Well, she has E Ionian here. So the question is, does playing a 1, a major 3, so I might be, so it wasn't a minor 3, so this is a minor 3, so let's look at it on my chord map. So we have, she had the full picture, but I didn't snag the full thing, so I'm just going to pull it up right here. So E Ionian, so E, G major, and B. So E, G major, and B. Are these considered a major chord while one, okay, so while 1, minor 2, and 5 is a minor chord. So explain the foundation between the context of the color wheel. So these root notes represent the whole chord. So E major being a major 1, this Roman numeral 1 represents all of the notes in that chord, just as E major represents all of the notes in that chord. So E major is E, G sharp, and B. It's represented by its root note, the yellow square, but on the keyboard, it's E, G sharp, and B. Like on the chord map, this represents, that circled E represents all 3 notes. And so if we were to play, like A, it's all of the notes of A major. And then if we come over here to A minor, it's all of the notes of A minor. And so the chord map is showing the root notes of those chords. And so that's the structure here and what those mean. And the labels also, represent. So E major is just an E. This is also known as F flat sometimes, not as commonly as E. And then E minor, the minor means that it's minor chord, and then also the root or the Roman numeral represents that it's a minor chord as well. And so anytime you have an uppercase Roman numeral, it's going to be major, and all of the uppercase Roman numerals are in the inner ring. And if it's a minor chord, it has minor in the name, the little M, and then also a lowercase Roman numeral. And then if it's diminished, it has this little circle, whether it's in the name or also in the Roman numeral. So it's like radiating rings of consonants. You have major chords in the inner ring, minor chords in the middle ring, and diminished chords. And so you could move between those notes, like, E major, G sharp major, and B. And it will sound kind of interesting, kind of epic sounding. So E, E major, G major, B. But just E major itself includes those 3 notes: E, G sharp, and E. So we are upon the hour. I love geeking out about music with you, and I'm looking forward to geeking out with you more on tomorrow's live stream, which I'll be posting heads up on that on YouTube. So thank you for geeking out with me, and thank you so much for your support. I'm really excited about part 5, how it's coming along. It's going to be posting here with the completion of all these parts, and more to come on that, and everything that once that dam breaks, there's lots of diagrams and fun stuff to be talking through. So more to come on that. And I hope you have a great rest of your day, great rest of your weekend, and we will be talking very soon. So take care.